One that has been, I would say, consistent is this concept of legitimacy and whether or not our leaders actually have the legitimacy to make the decisions that they're making. They're no longer asking, did Carney or whichever leader make the right decision? It's, do they have the right to make the decision? Which narratives have been dominating the Canadian discourse in 2026? So we only had 1 month, so really we're looking at January. But let's dig into what we've been seeing. One that has been consistent is this concept of legitimacy. Now, this comes primarily from voices on the right. They're no longer asking the question, did they make the right decision? It's, do they have the right to make the decision?
So to give an example of that, we've got from a couple days ago, Loose on the Moose, and he's positioning it. Legacy media admits it's propping up Carney. And to give another example, we've got Jasmine Lane. She's setting up global elites panic as Trump government torches them live.
So it's a different framing.
That's right. It all starts from Mark Carney and being a central banker and being, a former Brookfield official. But it actually keeps asking the question, does our government actually have Canadians' best interests in mind?
And that's a shift because in Canada, that legitimacy, if you win the election, it was assumed that you have the right to make the big decisions. But now it could be foreign policy, it could be domestic policy, but everything is an opportunity for those voices who want to contest this legitimacy, maintain this narrative. And I found also interesting how they leverage what's happened in Venezuela was used as a domestic warning story. So it was framed that Canada is on the same path that Venezuela was on, where these are warning stories of what's going to be the future of Canada under the current leadership. And
that's a very interesting approach. I feel it's a bit of a stretch in many ways because there's significant difference in the economies and the rule of law. But that's the approach that's being taken.
So before we move on from this, obviously, Carney's speech at Davos was a big news event. He had a lot of accolades from around the world, and it's particularly the Davos crowd. But do you think it changed hearts and minds over here?
Well, it definitely gave him a significant bump in a lot of the polling data. In many ways, this is reminiscent to the election campaign last year, where, a direct attack of Trump on Canada literally changed the course of an election. What's interesting is that this is being covered in two very different ways, depending on the left-leaning cluster or the right-leaning cluster. I would say the volume is a lot lower on the right, but it is a lot higher on the left when it comes to talking about Trump and the United States.
The high visibility of Davos and the fact that if you look at the way the narratives around that particular speech played out here in Canada, there wasn't anyone who was a hater who was suddenly like, oh, well, maybe this Carney guy's all right. It is just used to cement their pre-existing judgments about him as a leader.
It was light on details on how we achieved this objective of getting the middle power nations to work together.
So we talked a bit about where the right is coalescing. Are you seeing anything on the left?
Well, the left is following the same pattern as Carney to structure everything around the U.S. and Trump in particular.
Well, this is what has shifted within the last week. Obviously, the left mentions the U.S., mentions Trump. That has been going on for a long time. But what's happened recently is that we are seeing a convergence of framing what's happening in Canada to, does this look like something we saw in the US? So it's a comparison. This week that we saw a massive jump, something like close to 20% of all the left-wing creators on YouTube we're all using this comparing framing to the US, and is this US style, is this Trump style? So it makes it a more powerful, more influential because of that consistency of message. There's a uniting of those voices on one theme, gives it more authority. Those videos that took that approach, they were over indexing on views on average 12 to 15%. So it was actually paying off in getting more eyeballs onto their content.
Right. So we saw overperformance of Trump and U.S. In the data. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. Right.
But what I'll note, and something that we'll be watching in the next few weeks, is we had the conservative leader confirmation vote in Calgary last week. We're seeing an increase in very tight message around Pierre Poilievre's confirmation vote, around how strong the performance was and how it affirms as a leader. So it'll be interesting to see if we're seeing a similar convergence of messaging on the right as we just observed on the left.
Poilievre took a much bigger piece of the pie in terms of who was being talked about in this like newsfluencer space. And again, he was obviously singing to those who are already big fans of his. We didn't see that translate beyond those who already bought in. So back to the point we were making earlier around these big events, whether or not they are changing the minds of those who are sitting on the fence. So if you already hated Poilievre, you continue to hate Poilievre. And I think the bump we saw around this US Trump comparator was very likely driven by the left trying to continue to frame Poilievre as, a mini Trump, because that worked in the previous election in terms of painting him as a unlikable leader.
It's going to be a challenge for Poilievre to thread the needle between these two very opposing messaging. Do you concentrate on your core audience, which wants to hear a very specific message of delegitimacy, or do you try to engage with the more right of center and even the moderates or very center that probably want a more collaborative message? So that's a challenge.
So this leads me to the final major thread that we're seeing in this ecosystem. And it's something we talked about at the next campaign summit. We did a presentation on trust and building trust. And we talked about where are Canadians placing their trust is moving away. Mainstream media is not dead, but there is a shift in turning to individuals for news that people trust. So they're not expecting them to break the stories. That's still the realm of the mainstream media, but Canadians are turning more and more to these political influencers, these newsfluencers who give them context, who help them understand what does this mean. And how do you choose, right? Like, how do you decide who to listen to? And it really becomes a values-based decision than an expertise-based decision, which is the way it used to be, let's say 15, 20 years ago.
With incumbent media, that's right.
Or, you
Established.
listen to governments, you listen to the doctors, you listen to the experts. But now you're listening to someone who has zero expertise in the topic that they're speaking on. But you trust them because their worldview is the same as your worldview.
Right. You like first, then you trust.
But like this ecosystem, how much is this shifting?
So we've been collecting this data for over a year, and I find it really intriguing. So to start off, we're just going to show this slide here. So what we did is we took the top 10 influencers on the left and on the right, and we're comparing it to the top 10 incumbent media channels. And we're measuring the number of likes that they obtained in 2025. And what's really striking here, the red column is the left-leaning channels, and it's almost 1/3 of the size of the right-leaning channels. So a lot more likes, a lot more engagement. And we're seeing the same thing in terms of views and in terms of comments for the right-leaning channels. So very engaged. And if we look at incumbent media, which includes some massive channels like CBC News and CTV News that release thousands of videos per month, those only get about half of the engagement that the super influencers on the right are able to manage. So, quite
Before you move on, when you say engagement and likes, like what does that mean?
that means that not only is the user interested in the topic, they're motivated enough to engage with with the user, and I think that's really important because that shows a tight community that is building itself around that particular center of influence.
Now, but they could be saying you're stupid and I hate everything you just said, right? Like so comments doesn't always equate to agreement.
For sure, there's always a lot of trolling, but if we look at the comments, usually quite a certain majority is in agreement with the original influencer. So it isn't a definite indicator, but it's certainly an important indicator of the community's interest in the topic.
Okay.
But here's where the story gets a little more nuanced. These were the numbers for all of 2025. But when we look at a quarter per quarter, we're actually seeing a major increase in the presence and effectiveness on the left. So whereas the ratio was almost 3-to-1 in Q1 in the beginning of 2025, by the end of the year in December, the ratio is only 25 to 50% more. So still quite the advantage, if you will, for the right-leaning podcasters. But left-leaning channels have grown by leaps and bounds.
So why we're seeing the left suddenly catching up.
So I think in general, what we're seeing is the right colonized YouTube a lot earlier than the left. They've been at it probably for almost 10 years, gradually building their audience because they couldn't find an outlet for their opinions on what we'll call incumbent and traditional media. And so they built their own media ecosystem. But the Canadian elections was an inflection point, and we saw the appearance of a number of left-leaning influencers which has just increased their follower base significantly and are getting their audiences also to engage.
So before we wrap up here, as always, we have a so what. So Emmanuel, what's your so what of the narratives that we've observed over the first month of 2026?
Well, I think for all communicators, it's important to remember that you're working in an environment where you've got echo chambers on the left and on the right, and very rarely do the two mix. So you as a communicator need to be prepared to figure out, how do I find an adjacent audience that's willing at least to listen and that gradually can understand the point that I'm trying to make. You need to work at the edge and gradually build your audience based on shared values.
That's a great point. I did see one left-leaning TikTok creator talk about being approached by both NDP and Liberal parties to do content. And she said that she was not opposed in theory to that, but she wasn't convinced on what they wanted was aligned fully with her values as a creator. And number two, they didn't treat her as an independent voice, and they weren't actually interested in working with her as a person with an opinion. And I thought that was a very important bit of feedback for anyone who is in this game, right? To understand who you're working with and what their expectations are.
Right. And the rules of engagement are different.
We have to wrap our first episode of season 2. To all of you who are back for season 2, thanks for joining us. If you haven't, again, hit that follow, share. We'll be back next with our very first interview of a newsfluencer who is on TikTok. So watch for that towards the end of February. And as always, until next time.
Until next time.